Hi there. This lesson focuses on getting started with the Entity Framework in ASP.NET Core MVC. And in particular, we start off after the sort of setup exercise that you should have completed. There's an article on the course website that shows you how to install the necessary NuGet packages to use ASP.NET Core MVC within your project. And so you should have completed that and done some basic configuration. So we've already assumed that that's in place. It's in place within my project here. So if you haven't gone through those steps, please go back and do that first and then come back to the video and follow along. All right, so in this lesson, we're going to, just to summarize, we're going to look at some of the basic mechanics of setting up the persistence framework, the EntityFrameworkCore, to work with our cheese model class and to store those instances of those class in the database and translate between the object-oriented and relational worlds for us. And so I've set up a couple of sort of boilerplate pieces here already. So let's go ahead and look at those. And I'll put the exact code here on the course site in the notes section. So these two pieces are fairly boilerplate. Like I said, they're going to be pretty much the same each time you do them for different model classes. And so, they're not necessarily things you need to memorize every detail of. They're just things we need to kind of know how to refer to. So the first thing I've done is I've created a data folder. And within that data folder, I've created a new class called DBContext. Now, let me expand the models folder here, and you recall that we had this cheese data class, and this is what we were previously using to store data. It was what we referred to as a data store. It provided a bunch of methods for adding and retrieving cheese objects from a collection. This cheese DBContext is going to replace that functionality, and so by the end of this lesson, we'll have deleted this class and replaced all code snippets that were using it with usage of the cheese DBContext. So this cheese DBContext is a fairly simple class. It extends the DBContext class. So I've named it cheese DBContext because it's going to work with cheese instances, with instances of the cheese class. And there's not a lot we need to do to get this class set up for our code to use, other than extend this built-in class DBContext, which is part of EntityFrameworkCore. So I extend that class, and I do a couple more things. The first thing is I create a property, cheeses, that is a DB set. So DB set is, again, part of the Entity Framework, and it is going to represent a collection of cheese objects. And in particular, it's going to understand how to retrieve and place objects from and into the database for us. So I set this up, and we'll see how we use this in a moment. We'll be using it quite a lot today. And then I also create a constructor for my cheese DBContext. And this constructor is basically necessary for the correct creation of a DBContext class. And we'll see how and where this is created. But essentially, the framework is going to manage this class for us. It's going to go ahead and create a cheese DBContext to make it available to our code as long as we set it up in certain ways. And this constructor is part of doing that. So it's a constructor that takes something called the DBContext options that's parameterized to work with cheese DBContext. And then it calls the base constructor with that options object. Don't worry too much about what these things are. Again, we want to think about this primarily as boilerplate code that is necessary to wire up to get this DBContext class to work nicely within the context of the ASP.NET Core framework. Okay, and once again, I'll provide this code on the course notes so you can easily refer to it. Okay, there's one other piece of code that I've done already, and let's go to the startup.cs class. And then if we scroll down a little bit, we'll come to this configure services method. And compared to your configure services, you'll notice that there's a couple new lines of code here, these two lines right here. And so this method is a place where we can make the framework aware of services that we want to be available to the rest of the application. And in particular, I am registering the cheese DBContext with the framework in this location. So again, this is we're going to think of this primarily as boilerplate code. And if you're, in your future coding career, when you're working on these things, you'll probably get more familiar with how these things work and be able to customize them and work with them based on your particular situation. For us now, though, working with these DBContext classes, this line or two of code is always going to look exactly the same. basically what it does is it makes the framework aware of our cheese DB context, and we'll be able to then pull that class into our controllers in particular. And it also specifies the type of database that we'll be using to back up this class. So in the setup exercises, you set up a default connection string within your app settings. That is going to be referenced by this code in order to open up the local SQL Express database that is pointed to by the default connection string. So those are kind of the two things that this is doing. Once again, it's making the cheese DB context class available to other components of our application, and then also specifying where that database that it interfaces with is configured. Okay, so again, boilerplate code will provide details on the course notes section. All right, so let's go ahead and look at our model class. The whole point of doing this work is to be able to persist instances of model classes in a relational database. We're talking about object relational mapping, or ORM, and we've been working with objects. We want to have a way to translate those objects into relational databases, which will allow our data to persist from one startup of our application to another. Okay, and it'll also separate the data from the application itself, so we could, for instance, have our database on a separate server from our actual application. So let's open the cheese model class. And this is pretty much the way we left it. We've been playing around with some different properties, so you might have one or two additional properties that you've played around with. That's okay. The main important ones that we're going to be working with are right here. And so we need to do just one or two little things here to get this ready to work with the cheese DB context. Okay. In particular, I'm going to delete this code that sets up the unique ID for each instance of the class, and that's because the DB context is actually going to work with this class to help create that ID itself. So I can make a new public property int and call that ID. And then we'll see in a minute that when I create new cheese objects, the DB context will initialize this ID to be something unique for us. We don't have to do that extra work of keeping track of a counter and knowing which was the last ID that we used and making sure that the new one's unique. The framework will do that for us. The only thing we need to do is to make sure that our model class has an ID property that's an integer, and that in this case ID is spelled in a particular way. The framework wants to see this as capital I, capital D. You could have also alternatively have made this property this way. Another convention is to say cheese ID to preface the ID property name with the class name. Both of these are acceptable for the Entity Framework. We're going to use this one. It's going to be a little bit more generic, and it's also going to work a little bit better if you ever need to extend this class, and then you want to make persistent extensions of the cheese class. So let's go ahead and look at how we can use our cheese DB context within our controller to put objects in the database and retrieve them from the database within our controller. So I'm going to come over here and let's go to the controllers folder and open up our cheese controller. So essentially what I'm going to be doing is what I said earlier that we would do in this lesson, which is to replace the usage of the cheese data class with usage of the cheese DB context class. So that's what we're going to do within our cheese controller here. All right, so let's just kind of go down the file from top to bottom, and each place we see the cheese data class being used, we'll swap that out for cheese DB context, and the methods that we're going to be calling are going to be a little bit different, but we'll kind of learn about some of the methods that our DB context provides by seeing them used directly in our code. So right here in the index, I'm retrieving a list of all of the cheeses that are saved in my system. So previously, this cheese data class stored those in some kind of collection. And now with the cheese DB context, those will be stored in a database. So let's go ahead and wipe out this code usage right there. And here I want to use my cheese DB context to retrieve all the cheeses from the database. But one small problem, which is that I don't have a DB context. There's nowhere in here that I have a DB context to reference. So let's go ahead and set that up. So it's something we should have started with, but we didn't get too far before we caught that mistake. And so the way I'm going to work with a DB context within my controller is to make a private field of type cheese DB context. And I'm just going to call it context. So it's going to be a private field that I will use throughout my class, and I'll be able to reference that context and use it to interface with the database. Now, how is my controller class going to get one of these, right? So, this context, the Cheese DBContext object, there will be one available due to the setup work we did in the startup CS file. There will be one available within the framework if I just know how to ask for it. And so essentially the way I can ask for it, one way I can ask for it is by making a constructor that takes an instance of the Cheese DBContext. And then within that constructor, I can set the private field to be equal to the DBContext that was passed in. So what's going to happen here is the framework will create a cheese controller for us. That's always kind of been happening in the background. We've never had to create a cheese controller. That class has been managed for us by ASP.NET. And that's going to continue to happen, but I can customize the way in which that controller is created by providing a constructor. And in particular, I can ask for that constructor to receive an instance of Cheese DBContext. And since this class is registered as a service within startup.cs, the framework will be able to find one of those classes, one of those objects, and to hand it to me. And then I can just keep a handle on it by putting it in this private field. And then I can use that private field, that DBContext, throughout the rest of my controller. Okay, so now we have a way to reference our DBContext. Let's come down and use it within our index action method. So I can say context. And our context has, remember that it extends, let's just look at it very quickly. Remember it extends DBContext. So in terms of what we have to work with here, we get all of the properties and methods that are part of this class, which there are several that will be useful. We also get the stuff that we've defined here. In particular, we have a cheeses DB set, and we think of this as a collection of cheese objects. And so I can work with this particular collection, and I can ask for the context.cheeses. Now this is a DB set, which is not a list. However, I can turn it into a list by calling toList. And this is going to require me to add the using system.link. Okay, so this cheeses property is a DB set that holds on to cheese objects, and it has a toList method that I can use to turn that DB set into a list. Okay, and then this was already declared to be a list. My view is receiving that list, and it was treating it as a list. So that's the only change I need to make there for this action and the associated view to go ahead and work correctly. All right, so let's just go ahead and keep going down and see other places that we might be needing to replace cheese data with this new DBContext. All right, so right here in my add action, this is the add action that processes the form that will create a new cheese object. It is creating a new cheese object and storing that in the cheese data by saying cheesedata.add. Okay, so this is a really easy one to replace because I can say get rid of cheese data and I can say context.cheeses.add. Cheeses, there we go. And this will add that cheese to the DB set that is cheeses. Now, one more thing I have to do here is I have to save those changes. Whenever I'm modifying data within the database, after I make those modifications, I need to save them. So I just call context.saveChanges. All right, and that's the only change I need to make there to work. And this add method, again, the add and the save changes, we didn't write these. These are part of the DB set and the DBContext classes respectively. And so these will be methods that you'll be able to use regardless of the type of DBContext or the type of model object you're working with. As long as you've set up your DBContext correctly in this similar way, you will get these methods for free to use with your model classes. Okay, and then let's come down here. I have some code to remove cheeses. So this is going to take a little bit more work. Right here, in this one where I'm rendering the remove form, I'm just passing in a list of all the cheeses. So we've already seen how to do that. So that one's not new. We can say context.cheeses.toList. This is the same thing we did above in our index action. Okay, and now here I'm going to need to do introduce a new concept in order to be able to remove the IDs. All right, so in particular, I'm receiving from the view when the form is submitted an array of integers called cheese IDs. Okay, and so actually that reminds me, within the view, before we do that, when we render the remove form, we're actually using these cheese IDs, aren't we? So we should make sure that those are being displayed properly within that view form. So when we come down and go to the remove template, and we see this would have created a problem for us. Eventually, we see that we're referencing the cheese ID property, but we replace that property with a property that's just called ID. So let's just go ahead and make that change. And I may have it in 3 places. So, whoop. All right, and that looks like it will work. My vbag.cheeses here. This is we haven't refactored this to use a view model, but you can do that if you like. That would be a best practice to do. But in any case, we're using that list of cheeses, and then we're referencing the ID property on each one to create that form. Okay, so back in our controller. So this will now work properly. That entire controller, action method, and view are working together properly. And then I will receive an integer list of cheese IDs, and I will loop over those. And here I'm basically calling this remove method. This remove method within cheese data takes an ID, and it knows how to remove the cheese with that specific ID. Okay, so I'm not going to be able to do that anymore because we're trying to get rid of the usage of that cheese data class. What I can do, though, is I can do the following. So I want to be able to retrieve the cheese that I want to remove from my DBContext. To do that, I can say cheese, the cheese. And here I want to call my context, and I can, again, reference my cheeses DB set, but rather than getting all of them, I want to get a specific one. So if I want to do that, I can use the single method to retrieve a single object from that DB set. And the way I want to specify what that single object in the DB set is by giving it a link-like query. So we saw a link and the syntax associated with that sort of set of query methods previously. The way I can do that here is I can say that I want to retrieve all objects in the collection C such that C.id equals the particular ID that I'm working with in that loop iteration. So recall that this for loop is going through, we might have several cheeses that we're asking to remove from the system, and we're going to loop, and for each one of those, we're going to do this method of retrieving that specific cheese. Now, once I have a handle on that specific cheese, I can go ahead and remove it. So I can say context.cheeses.remove and tell it that I want to remove this particular object. Okay. And that will work the same. Now again, since we've modified the data in the database, we need to save our changes. And rather than doing it on each loop iteration, I'm going to just wait till the end and do it all at once. Okay, so that we've refactored this remove action, both the get action and the post action, to work with our DB context. And so in doing so, we've actually removed all of the usages of this cheese data class. Let's just go ahead and delete it since we don't need it anymore. And now that we've done this, we're pretty close to being able to run our application and see it work. The thing I want to do, though, is I just want to make sure I made a lot of changes, and I just want to make sure that my application doesn't contain any errors. So I'm just going to build the solution. And if I did have any errors, if I left anything out, if I've accidentally left the reference to cheese data in there, this will find them. All right, so our build succeeded with no errors, so we're pretty good to go. So one more thing I need to do before I can start up my application and start using the database with this new DBContext and my persistent model class is I need to set up the database to actually have the table or tables that it needs to store this data. We haven't done anything with the database itself. And in general, we're not going to have to be too hands-on with managing the database. However, the database, which is an in-memory database, the SQL Express local database, is basically going to be a file on the system that will store our data. But it doesn't even know about the tables or the type of data that we're about to ask it to store. So in order to do that, we need to create what's called a migration. And so a migration, very briefly, is going to be just a short program, or you think of it as a script, that will contain a set of changes that will update the database based on changes you made to your model. So every time you're working within your code, if you change one of your persistent model classes, you'll need to create a database migration to update the database to reflect those changes. So let's see how we can create our first database migration. So there's some tools that will allow us to do this from the command line, and you've already set those up in that setup exercise. So we're going to use those now. Come over to the Solution Explorer and right-click on Cheese MVC and come down to Open Folder in File Explorer. That will open up the File Explorer to that same directory. And we're not going to work within File Explorer. This is just a simple trick to quickly get to what we want to do next. Go to the location bar and click into that to the far right of the location bar and type in PowerShell and hit Enter. That will open up a PowerShell window, and notice that the path is already set to that specific path within my project. And that's important because the things we're about to do require you to be at this root path within your project for the migration tools to work. Okay, so let's introduce our first migration. So the syntax to create a migration is .NET EF migrations add. So this says .NET Framework should use the entity framework to create a new migration, and I need to give it a name. This is my first migration, so I'm going to call it initial migration. Your migration names will be, you want those to be descriptive of the changes that were made in the model since the last migration. So when I hit enter, this will look at my code. If it hasn't been compiled recently, we'll go ahead and compile it. We just did a build, so it sees that it doesn't need to compile it. And it looks like it was done. It gives us this little message that if I want to undo this action, I can remove the migration with this syntax. There are a few common migration commands that you will use, and we're going to look at just 2 of them in this lesson. We'll put the 2 or 3 more on the notes section of the course page for this lesson. All right, so now to actually have those changes reflected in the database, I need to run the migration. So let's just look at first, though, what that just did. So if I go back to my Solution Explorer, I notice I have a new folder over here called Migrations. And within that, I have 2 new C# classes. I have one right here with this big number that looks like it's a timestamp, and it actually is. So this will help you tell when you created the migration. And then it's also appended by the migration names. This is a quick way to figure out which migration you're looking at. And as we create more and more migrations, we'll have more and more of these classes in this folder. And if I open this up, you can kind of scan through this. We're not going to cover kind of what's going on here in detail, but you can kind of see that there's some code that looks like it's working with database tables and setting them up properly, and that's indeed the case. So this is going to create a table called cheeses that's going to have specific columns, and these columns were generated based off of the properties that were in my persistent cheese class. Okay, so that's pretty cool. And then this other file is essentially, again, you can consider this a snapshot of what your model class looked like when you created the migration. So you're not going to need to be concerned with what these are doing in any level of detail now. If you were working with more complex applications, you might have to customize these migrations, but in this case, we won't. Okay, so let's go back to PowerShell and let's run our first migration. So the migration has been created, but those changes haven't been applied to the database yet. To actually make them, to apply them and have them be reflected in the database, we need to run .NET EF update database. And this will update the database to reflect the most current migration, okay? And it looks like I got that syntax backwards here. This says EF update database. That should be the other way around. Sorry about that. .NET EF database update. And again, this will check for to see if we have a most recently compiled version of our code, and if it hasn't been compiled recently, it will recompile it. In this case, that wasn't necessary. And it will apply those changes to the database. All right, that completed successfully. Let's go back to Visual Studio, and we can actually see what happened when we ran that command. So if you go to View and go to SQL Server Object Explorer, and you can look at a view similar to this. I'm just going to pin this on the left-hand side so it'll stay open. And we can look at this top entry for you. It should show you the databases that you have within SQL Express. And I've been working with this application in terms of preparing these lessons, so I have a couple of these, but you'll only see one. In particular, yours will be called Cheese MVC. I have one that I've created specifically for this lesson that has this EF basic appended on it. But you can expand this, and then you can look at the tables within your database and actually browse these and see what has been created by the migrations script for you. And so in particular, I see that I have a cheeses table right here. If you right-click on that and say View Data, that will show you the data associated with that database table. And in particular, I don't have any data yet, but I see I do have 4 columns that correspond to the 4 properties that I want to persist as part of this, this Entity Framework Managed class. So we'll come back to this in a second after we run our application to actually see that there's data from our classes within that table. All right, so now we're ready to run our application. If all went well, we'll go ahead and start this up, and things will work. So go ahead and start up your ASP.NET application. All right, there we go. Our application started up just fine, and we don't have any data within our system yet, and that's fine. We're about to add some. Let's go ahead and test out the add functionality with our new persistent code. All right, so here I can enter in a cheese name and a description. And nothing too mind-blowing, right? And we didn't see anything significantly different, or actually different at all from the last time we ran this application, except if we go back here to Visual Studio, we can look at the data within our database and see that we've actually stored something within our database here, right? So I actually have a row with the values that were just created by my application. All right, so that's pretty cool. So let's go ahead and just make a couple of more additions to this application. All right, and we'll make a soft cheese just for fun. Okay, and so the only reason I want to do that is I want to show you that this is persistent data. So if I go ahead and stop the application and restart it, we'll see that that data still exists once I've restarted the application. And there we are. The same data that was there last time we ran the application is still there because it was stored in a database and persisted outside of our application rather than within the application's memory. So those are the basics of storing a single persistent object in a database using the Entity Framework. We'll look at some more complicated ways to work with data, in particular ways that we can form relationships between our classes and have those relationships reflected in the database in a future lesson.